moving along here, but I want to welcome everyone here to the first session of our kickoff session of the AI Knowledge Bytes, Artificial Intelligence in Libraries Lunch and Learn series. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We have a great session to get us started. We've got Greg Argo with Minitex and Simon Deutsch with St. Catherine's University, who will be joining us, sharing their presentation on AI-assisted review, creative solutions for outdated e-resource data. And I am looking forward to this, and I hope you are too. Let me move forward here. This session is going to be about 20 minutes in length, followed by plenty of time for Q&A. And we will then also share the recording of this session on our Minitex YouTube channel. We will follow up with a survey at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. We will monitor those questions as we move through, and we will have the presenters address the questions at the end of their session. I am Carla Fall, your moderator for today's session. Joining me is Sarah Ring, also moderating this session. And our presenters are Simon Deutsch and Greg Argo. We will we'll show this link and QR code to the survey afterwards. I think we are ready to get going. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand things over to Greg and Simon. Take it away.
Thank you, Carla, for the introduction. We're talking about e-resources today and AI-assisted review. I think this is kind of the story of a surprise solution. So hold on, I'm going to provide context, and then Simon will tell you how he solved the problem. I'm Greg Argo, so I've been at Minitex as the Open Education Affordable Content Librarian for about 2.5 years now. Before that, I was in the Twin Cities in various positions and included managing e-resources and wrangling data. Simon?
My name is Simon Deutsch. Last summer, I was the practicum student at Minitex, and currently I'm a student in my final year of the MLIS program at St. Kate's with a focus on digital libraries.
Okay, so I think many of you know what Minitex is, but there are a few who are a little bit further afield. So what is Minitex? It's a state-funded library organization, and it's located at the University of Minnesota here in the Twin Cities. Our mission is to strengthen libraries, cultural institutions, and the communities that they serve. It started way back in 1969 as the Minnesota Interlibrary Teletype Experiment, and that was for enhancement of ILL service. Well, and look at that cool teletype machine. Looks like you could really fire off some text messages with that puppy. We've got updated technology at a certain point here in the 70s, but we kept the coordinator role and then also expanded services to include reference, cataloging, statewide database acquisitions, digital library support, and cooperative purchasing through our CPERS department. So what is CPERS? You may know the people in CPERS. Dana Cosienda does the products. Ann Hatton and myself, we manage most of the electronic resource transactions and renewals. Ann Casti is our K-12 liaison, and she handles orders for K-12. And Matt Lee is the supervisor of the department. We offer discounted pricing on a wide range of e-resources and library products. And we work with over 100 vendors. We support the libraries by coordinating orders, renewals, providing technical assistance, and licensing stuff. We provide educational outreach, for instance, webinars on licensing, ADA Title II, OER, and stuff like that. And we're available to all libraries across the three-state Minitex service region. So we serve Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota directly, but we also will take orders and manage e-resources for anybody. So, how does CPERS at Minitex work? We have software, of course, where everything's focused, all of our activities. It's a homegrown backend application called CSDB, which stands for Cost Savings Database. We manually enter and maintain all of our records here, so there's no bulk upload feature, there's no loader, there's no add, edit, or delete files. Everything is handled manually. So we have records for libraries, for vendors, e-resources, physical products, and then orders and renewals. CSDB connects to both our front end, my Minitex, which many of you have accounts in, and our financial back end here at University of Minnesota. It allows CSDB has functionality that allows us to generate renewal notices via email, generate actionable offers in your library's My Minitex account, and generate invoices via the financial backend I was just talking about. Our workflow is cyclical and has continuity through time. It's not necessarily a serials workflow, but it kind of has similar feel to it for me. New renewal notices are generated from the previous year's orders, which are attached to e-resource and library records. And then the renewal becomes the order, becomes the subscription, becomes the renewal, becomes the order, and so on and so forth. So what's the problem here? Well, e-resources get bought and sold, renamed, repackaged, bundled, acquired, merged, all that kind of stuff frequently. And also, CPERS needs to be able to enter bespoke entries for unique bundles and packages. These old names simply trip up people and processes. Not everybody knows the old name, right? So within CSDB specifically, these updates break the cyclical workflow I was just talking about. And then also the updates break tracking the historical record. For us, a view of the historical record helps every year when we're managing vendors and the pricing they sent out, and just trying to make sure that they're not pumping prices up too much. So on the left here, you'll see an example renewal email that we've sent out with old information. CQ Weekly is now known as CQ Magazine, and you can see this in the FAQ. And it always goes ashamedly all the way back to 2016, and into 2024, we're still sending things out with CQ Weekly. So this is not the best situation from our perspective. So what are the stakeholders' problems? So our financial team gets confused when invoices we get from vendors don't match the CSDB orders with the entities that we've entered manually. Library directors or others may be confused when looking at the Minitex value proposition reports that have just started coming out, and you may have gotten some a couple days ago if you were Minnesota Academic or Public Library. We confuse ourselves when we switch our vendor portfolios between each other. So then you don't have the experience needed. And new e-resource librarians don't know the old names. So, who's your favorite singer? Robert Zimmerman, Joan Turner, Reginald Dwight, Cheryl Sarkisian, Paul Houston, or Gordon Sumner? Or might be an easier question to answer if I said, who's your favorite singer? Bob Dylan, Joan Jett, Elton John, Cher, Bono, or Sting? So that is, in a microcosm, is sort of, I think, the problem that we've been perpetuating. So this summer, we had a Minitex practicum. 3 different units within Minitex collaborated on this. CPERS, we had 4 weeks, and Simon was the inaugural practicum student. Out of the 4 weeks in CPERS, we focused on updating vendor and e-resource records in CSDB for 1 week. We were hoping that the practicum student would get exposure to e-resources in the real world with a window into one organization's workflow, warts and all. This is an actual outline provided to Simon. Not a ton of detail, but the task was confirm or deny the existence of e-resources in a spreadsheet. We're not looking at all the e-resources, so we exported a report with just the ones that we had sold. We also have entered things that we've not sold. We also exported the CSDB resource name, the CSDB vendor name, and in the spreadsheet, Simon was supposed to confirm that it still existed, yes or no. Yes, but it's changed, or I can't tell. And my best guess is, and that's where the can't tell notes comes in. And then if there was a new current e-resource name, enter it. If there's a current vendor name, enter it, and then enter any sort of website that had some information. So this just will show you, oops, let me go back. Maybe. I was trying to show you the scale. So this is the image that we were looking at earlier. But, you know, he has quite a few, 1,400 or so. I didn't say that it was a huge project. There's 1,400 or so singers names that he needs to confirm, or in our case, e-resource names to confirm. So I guess with that little secret out now, we'll pass it on to Simon, and I'll be controlling the slides. So forgive me if I'm a little behind.
Right on. Thanks, Greg. So before I jumped into the e-resource entities specifically, I first worked on refreshing some of the vendor-specific information. The Minitex site has 40 vendor overview pages that had all been added or updated at different times. So I first went through and standardized the format and content across those pages. I also did that with the CSDB vendor entities, which there were 80. I did all of this manually, kind of Google searching, tracking down which vendors and which kind of updates needed to be made for those. This was both helpful for my own knowledge or understanding of e-resources, of which I came into the project with a pretty limited understanding. But it also gave me a general sense of how the different vendors were presenting the products they have to offer. And so once I completed the vendor side of it, I moved on to the e-resource entities. This first part where I was doing all the manual searching of these 80 entities ended up taking about half the time or so, depending on which way you break it up. But you can go to the next slide then. So by the time I got around to working with the CSDB entities for the e-resources specifically, I pretty much knew right away there was no way I was going to get through a significant portion of all 1,400 of the e-resources if I tried to do it in the same manual way that I did with the vendors. So I thought I would spend just one afternoon and figure out how plausible it would be for me to automate something like this at a large scale. We highlighted some of the entities in the database that were particularly important or were maybe more popular that I could go through if I wasn't able to get through all of them as kind of a focus, but I figured it would probably not be much use for me to hand over a partially completed sheet that barely made a dent in the whole set. And I'd been doing some personal projects over the summer where I was experimenting with using LLMs for software development. This is kind of colloquially called vibe coding. Now, I don't have a significant coding background. I would say I struggle to retain much of the various attempts I've had at learning to program over the years, especially once you get down to kind of syntax and other language specific nuances. But what I think is most compelling to me is figuring out to what extent AI will be able to augment the work that librarians do, especially ones like me that feel maybe a little bit out of their depth when it gets down to the ones and zeros of development. The question is kind of what if all you need to develop functioning software as a librarian is good reference interview skills. And so vibe coding is kind of what the overall popular term for this concept is. It was originally coined by one of the OpenAI co-founders, Andre Carpathy. It's most often used from what I've seen among kind of Silicon Valley big tech types. I see a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek jokes about, prompting saying, write me a code from scratch that'll develop $1 million software as a service business, My broad, I would say largely untested hypothesis is that librarians and LIS professionals actually have a unique skill set that is really well suited for this vibe coding approach, where you're using natural language to describe the key elements of the software that you're looking to develop, especially when you consider the nature of reference interviews and the importance of asking the right questions and trying to understand the full context of a question or a problem. Go to the next slide. Research on vibe coding itself is relatively limited at this point. Most of what's currently out there are overviews on like domain specific projects, like especially for the medical field. But the article referenced here is one that I found particularly useful. It provides a more high level overview or analysis on what is currently out there. There are a lot of comparisons between different AI models, how they've been applied in specific contexts. The full references here, I found this quote to be particularly helpful in getting at what I'm trying to convey when I'm thinking about librarians and how they may be a good fit for this approach. When you shift the cognitive load away from the low-level syntax and the repetitive implementation details, and you look towards that system-level understanding, you as a librarian may have a pretty good understanding of how your LMS or other digital tools work on a high level, but it might be those specific lines of code underneath the system that impede your ability to customize or manipulate it in a way that will maybe make your workflow less painful. This seems especially promising if you're working with software that's open source, because it's likely that whatever LLM model you're working with has a lot of information on that code base somewhere in its training set already. It's just a matter of coaxing that out through setting sufficient context. So now I'm going to start talking a little bit about how I approach this specific project. My typical go-to strategy for this is to try to get a robust JSON prompt that I can tweak and use as project instructions for a new Claude project. Typically, I get a template for this prompt by trying to describe what I'm trying to accomplish in natural language as best as I can in a totally new chat. I normally do this because I'm a little more familiar with JSON now, but I'm not always entirely confident that the structure that I'm going to set up is totally going to be sufficient for guiding the software development. And so I do a little bit of a kind of meta prompting strategy where I'm using the LLM to try to generate the most effective prompt I can that I'll then bring over to another instance or another chat of this same LLM. And so in this case, I had a chat session where I first asked for a research template, and then I continued to narrow down possibilities for how it could be approached for automation. I used familiar natural language prompting strategies like defining explicit roles. You are a metadata and e-resource specialist. I also used some of those classic open-ended questions from reference interviews, like if I wanted to try this on a larger scale, how could I accomplish that? Data privacy and research accuracy are primary priorities. And once I was satisfied with the output from this, I concluded the chat with a request for the JSON prompt that I could then bring into a new project. So now I'm going to say a little bit about JSON prompting, which is JavaScript object notation. It's a widely used data format. Depending on what interest brought you here in the first place, it's probably a pretty good chance that you are somewhat familiar with JSON already. The nice thing about JSON is that there's a lot less ambiguity when you compare it to natural language. Especially for prompting, this is really helpful when you're trying to get at repetitive tasks that need consistent outputs. I also think JSON generally has a good balance of machine versus human readability. One drawback, though, is like I was mentioning, it can be more time consuming to craft these prompts. The meta prompting strategy I found has helped me increase the efficiency in that, though. Next slide. So very quickly, this is a screenshot of a portion of the system instructions that I brought over to the Claude project. And in Claude, a project is essentially just a folder that you can store chats, certain file types. There's some software integrations you can do. And it allows you to build out a context that you can then create chats in that folder that will operate on. I haven't seen anywhere specifically, but I believe it's a similar concept as RAG, where you include your own documentation and context that'll have more weight when the LLM is generating responses. Some of the main blocks defined in this JSON, like system role, project context, initial assessment questions, and so on, are kind of key elements here, key objects that structure how the LLM is approaching the development process. And next slide. Within the Claude project, the initial system instructions, they first prompted a brief assessment, and it asked me to answer questions about my technical background and experience, what kind of technical environment I was working in, how data was stored, on and on. I answered these questions, and it immediately started giving me step-by-step instructions for how I could begin to implement this program or complete the task. It was telling me console commands to run, folders to create, how to name columns in spreadsheets so that they work well with the scripts. And it was also giving me a lot of estimates for cost saving or efficiency resources, which I kind of quickly learned to ignore. At one point, it said it was going to cost like $200 to process all the resources, which would have been a prohibitive cost. But either way, this approach worked really well when I used it through the Claude desktop app. Instead of using something like Claude Code that I could bring directly into the coding environment, because it allowed me to have a more hands-on approach with the code, I was actually having to create files and structure them within the environment rather than just letting Claude loose and having it do all the work. So for me, with limited development experience, I thought this was a good approach because there's a little bit of a more active learning process that helps me sharpen my skills as I'm doing this work, and will hopefully result in better outcomes in the future. It's a very iterative process. I would build out the scripts and structure that it would tell me to. I would try to run it. Oftentimes, or the first few times, there would be errors. You paste the errors back in the chat, and it kind of has this back and forth where you're kind of slowly refining how it works until you finally get something that you are able to work with. Sometimes it would tell me a whole new script that it would say just copy paste and replace this whole script. Other times it would point to specific lines and say, here are the parameters that need to be changed, or here's how you can change these lines. Next. So once I was through with a development that was strong enough that I was able to have a full VS Code that was able to process some CSVs, I ran a small batch test with 20 resources. At this point, I still wasn't even sure that this process was going to work, that the output was going to be usable in any way. But I chose 20 resources, some that I knew would be pretty easy, some that I thought might be a little trickier. I went back and forth and I copy pasted the error messages until I had the CSV that I could share. When all was said and done for this first initial test of 20, I had the presentable CSV output, and it only cost like 2 cents in API tokens. I shared the output with Greg and Ann H, and we decided that the results were good enough to warrant processing the full set of resources. But before proceeding in that, we decided that the CSV output from the script should be refined a little bit so that it lines up a little better with the original CSV that we were all working off of, that Greg shared the structure of a bit earlier. So I did a little bit more natural language prompting to make modifications in the script. I ensured that all the original columns were represented, but I also added some quality control columns that would make it easier to sort through the larger set in the end. I also removed some columns in the name of token efficiency, especially ones that were producing duplicate outputs. And I specified that results with high confidence could have comparably less detailed research notes than those with low or medium confidence. The last feature that I requested was batch processing. This allowed for a greater means of quality control throughout the process. And if it were to be interrupted midway, I could resume right where I left off. So this is a screenshot that just shows the 2 sets of column headers and compares them between the pilot test and the final test. You can just see kind of the slight variations in how the columns are structured and what information is included and what is not. The last step before I was able to actually go through and bring in all of the entities, I decided to do a little bit of OpenRefine cleanup. I went through and I removed, I separated the vendor and the resource names, the only 2 data items that were needed from the first CSV. I separated those and I brought them into OpenRefine. I removed duplicates or test entities that would have turned up kind of no results. I also used faceted classification to find places where there were resources or vendor names that were meant to mean the same thing, but maybe were formatted slightly differently. I was thinking at this point, any extra entity would be extra token costs, and this cut out about 100, which wasn't a substantial difference, but it definitely helped. So I went on to process the full set using this batch strategy. It broke the set up into 28 separate batches of 50 resources each, and it would pause between each batch and wait for me to confirm through the console that it could proceed with the next. This overall took about 3 hours of processing time. And after that, all the batches were in separate CSV files. So I again asked for another script that could be used to combine them all, which was done successfully. And I was able to upload the final results into our shared Google Sheet. And the final cost of processing all 1,300 resources ended up coming in at less than $3 or less than $4, which is significantly less than the random $200 it was estimating near the beginning of the project. This cost is even including the tests that I had ran. I had ran a few extra tests on the second output just to make sure that before I started processing the second output, there was no huge quality jumps between the first results and the second. And then finally, when I brought the CSV back into the original Google Sheet, I applied some conditional formatting so the results could be parsed easier. Any columns that had low or medium confidence, I highlighted red and yellow respectively. And then I also added filters to the columns so that the resources could be searchable by vendor or resource name. And at that point, that's pretty much where my work ended on the project. And I handed it back to Greg and Anne.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Simon. So at this point, we've got the spreadsheet with all the new information in it. We needed to figure out kind of how to prioritize it, I guess. So we decided to sort by the new e-resource name column and assess what's there. To prioritize, we also wanted to know, like which of these have actually recently been ordered. So I use VLOOKUP to find recently ordered. We weren't able to actually export the order dates with the original data. An artifact of the homegrown system or me not being smart enough to use it correctly. But anyway, I can still do a little VLOOKUP. So we figured out that there were 420 different e-resources that have been ordered between end of 2023 and whenever that was in August. 151 of those actually had a new e-resource name. 82 beyond that don't have a new e-resource name, but have a new vendor name. And then 5 beyond those, which are either a no or an unsure for does it still exist. We had 238 e-resources to review manually instead of 1,455. That's an 84% reduction. But we also will need to look for false negatives, so things that weren't turned up by AI or that it may have missed. But overall, I would kind of look at the process as being a really well-heeled tipster and pointing us in the correct direction. I was just going to show you real quick what it kind of looks like on our end now. So I have already done the VLOOKUP and sorted. So we've got, this many rows. These top ones, look at column D. Those are the ones with a new e-resource name. Sorry if I'm going kind of fast. And then we run out of those, but we have ones in column C that have a new vendor name. And you can see some of these are because of acquisition. Some of these are just because the vendor changed their name. Different sorts of problems throughout the data set. And then some of these that we'll have to take a look at because it doesn't think it exists still, but doesn't have a new name or new resource name. All right. So what are we going to do now? So the workflow in the homegrown database application, CSDB, we met with the database administrator and developers and they decided that they'd be able to modify the CSDB functionality. They're going to create a workflow for updating to new versions of e-resources. So we're going to need to identify these ahead of time, and we've got a pretty good first step there. When there is a new e-resource name or new vendor for the e-resource, CPERS is going to need to create the new e-resource record 1st. So it'll be sitting there waiting to be used. And then when the renewal process comes upon us, 2 or 3 months ahead of the start date, we'll start the renewal process from the old subscription e-resource name, but be able to attach and move the renewal record to a different e-resource before offering the renewal. Then we'll send out the renewal offer email to the library, and we can modify those before we send them out to explain what's going on. We don't have this figured out yet, but we'll still need to sort out how it will display and convey the right message and correct information in the front end of my Minitex. So what is our plan? January 1 and July 1 are the start dates of most of the renewals. So we're trying to plan around those. It's probably too late now to do anything with the January 1 cycle. So we're going to shoot for the July 1, 2026 cycle. We need to prepare a spreadsheet with what updates are needed and sort that by start date so we can work ahead. We'll create new e-resource records in CSDB in anticipation and communicate out via Minitex Messenger and direct email to renewal contacts to let them know in general that we're doing this project. And then, this is remediation, but then keeping things up to date moving forward is also going to be possible with new workflow in CSDB. We might request a flag from the developers so that we can flag e-resource records that are going to need an update next cycle. And I'd like to continue to use Simon's process to check for what things need updates. I think that we'll be aware of some of them, but some of them may slip under the radar. Now we're going to just talk a little bit about lessons learned, key takeaways. I would say, if you're doing a practicum or something like that, don't overscope your project. Don't make it too specific. We left it pretty loose and open-ended. And since I didn't really know what Simon's skill set was, we ended up with a nice surprise. Instead of having, 80 or 100 e-resources of 1,400 processed manually, he figured out a way to get information about all of them. For internal systems, just make sure you have a list of issues and continually work toward improving them. AI is promising for data enhancement. However, I would stress to treat it as contributing to the overall review process, not replacing it. AI works well with specifiable data problems, and the more you can specify, the better. And using JSON to specify it in a structured way is even better. Working well with AI includes a set of skills beyond common sense and natural language chatbot prompting, but not that far beyond. So it's within reach, I would say. And Simon showed how you can do a lot of that through, like you kind of get to the next step every time through more natural language prompting. And then finally, I would just say, think about knowledge management here. What is your organization's approach to preventing siloed and orphan projects? Those, of course, are more likely when there's a limited amount of technical expertise in very technical projects. So part of, I think, getting used to the new environment is getting people's skills raised across the board in this sort of stuff.
All right. So this, on my end, I would say largely that this was a really good opportunity for me to try and see how this process works out in a practical work environment. I would say that I probably could have made a more frictionless workflow for myself if I were to have embedded an LLM directly into my coding environment, VS Code, if I was using Claude Code or Copilot. But there would have been some pretty significant trade-offs. If it was a bigger project and I was constantly running out of chat context in the Claude project, the direct embedding would have maybe been more useful. But the drawback would be then that it would make it so much easier for me to kind of just let the AI agent do everything. If the goal is for me to develop a better understanding of the software development while I'm working at this, I think the more hands-on approach is the way to go. Also, maybe this goes without saying, but policy compliance is crucial. The Minitex AI policy allows for the use of any model when using public data, so I opted to use Claude. This is the only one that I have experience with for doing this kind of work, so I would say that's an important note to make as well. I've heard the latest Google Gemini model is pretty impressive in this realm, but I have no experience using it. It was a great this project was a great testing ground because I didn't have any direct access to any internal systems. So I was kind of siloed off in my own little playground. The flexibility in the Minitex policy was really helpful. If there were significant institutional hurdles, even in the context of low stakes experiments like this, we might not have had enough time to get through the whole process. The last thing I would say is that professional software engineers are not replaced by this by any means, especially if you're going to be working with something that's going to have more direct integration in your internal systems. You're going to want a thorough review undertaken by IT of anything you generate. I could see a benefit here is that it would be much easier for a librarian to kind of independently develop and work on a script or a plugin that they would like to use in their workflow, and then bring it to the relevant organizational actors so they can review or assess it, rather than trying to convince those same developers to work on your program from scratch for you with the limited time and resources they have. Again, that's kind of my armchair assessment. I'd be happy to hear pushback from any developers in the audience who might have a take on this. And thank you.
Thanks, Greg and Simon. That was very insightful. We do have a question in the chat from Lacey. Where did the research notes come from? Were they added by Claude in the JSON processing?
Yeah, so the research notes, that was kind of the crux of it, is that the script really just automated an API call to the Claude API. And so that's where the research notes came from. They were from the Claude research. There was a research prompt embedded in the script that outlined all of the requirements that we were looking for, and it just had blank spaces for each of the e-resource and vendor pairs. And so then the output, the CSV, was just formatted in the way that the prompt specified.
Okay. Are there any other questions? We've got, oh, someone's clapping. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Sarah. So I think, Greg, it was you that mentioned that eventually you'll publish a newsletter article about the project. Do you have any sense of when that will be? Just curious.
Let's say before the end of 2025.
Thanks.
Do you see, either of you see this work that Simon did being applicable to any other pieces of work within CPERS, cooperative purchasing?
I'm not sure that this specific one about looking for updated names and vendors would, but I think the process in general is ripe. And in my previous position, working with Leganto data and courses and all that sort of stuff, I could see how this would be incredibly helpful, because you're always wrangling the data that's coming from multiple systems to try to make it in sync, work together.
Great.
And I know from from being an e-resource librarian, you've got all kinds of data sitting around in various states of currency and usefulness. So I think in general that this might be useful for e-resource librarians.
All right. Well, I will, please let us know if you have any other questions. You can either unmute or add them to the chat. I will share my screen right now and bring up that survey link again. So you can go to z.umn.edu/AIKB survey to take our survey about today's session and let us know your thoughts. Sarah, is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, just that, we'll follow up with an email once the recording's ready. We take a close look at it and try to fix the transcript before we send it out. So there may be a slight delay there, but we'll share the link to the recording as well, and any handout links that were shared.
Great. Thank you. All right, please keep in mind, as I mentioned before we started, this was the kickoff session for our AI series. We do have 5 more sessions in the series up ahead. November 20th will be our, 6 more. November 6th will be the AI and alt text for archival image collections, followed by November 20th. Greg Argo is back again with our Associate Director Matt Lee on AI and research tools using React framework to evaluate AI features in library databases. We have another session December 11th, Harnessing AI for OER. January 22nd will be AI and accessibility, why keeping humans in the loop matters. And our last session in the series will be February 19th, AI for transcription in digital collections. Thanks for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.